we go. Hi and welcome to Help for Heroes second Hot Topics webinar. If you're an audience member this evening, I'd like to remind you that your video and microphone have been automatically switched off. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please pop them in the Q&A box, which should be at the top of your screen. And then there'll be a Q&A section at the end, and we hope to get through as many questions as we can for you guys. Our guest presenter this evening will be John Paul Nevin. He served in the Army for 15 years. He's currently a senior lecturer at Buckinghamshire New University, and he has over 20 years experience in the field of strength and conditioning. So he's really knowledgeable and knows his stuff. He's going to be taking you through the fundamentals of strength and conditioning, a bit of theory that you can apply to your own training. So without further ado, I will hand over to JP.
Thanks, Amy. Evening all. My name is John Paul Nevin, and as Amy mentioned, I previously served in the Army for 15 years. The majority of that time was spent in the Royal Army Physical Training Corps, where I served as an exercise rehabilitation instructor. A number of tours of Afghan, tours at Headley Corps, and a regional rehabilitation unit. Post leaving the military, I then actually went to work for Help for Heroes, where I was the lead strength conditioning coach for a number of years at Tedworth House. And I've since now moved into academia, and I'm the senior lecturer in strength conditioning at Buckinghamshire University, where I lead our strength conditioning programs, one of which actually is geared specifically towards service PTIs. This evening, I'm just going to be giving you roughly a 45-minute webinar on something known as the fundamentals of strength conditioning. And these are the fundamentals which underpin essential, effective strength conditioning practice. So the aims of this evening's session are, firstly, to review the role of strength conditioning in performance enhancement, to then define some of the major components of physical fitness, to review some of the theories of training adaptation, and finally to define the fundamental principles of training which underpin effective strength conditioning practice. Now, this lecture today will be somewhat theoretically based, but I think it's quite important to understand the underlying theory, because when you can understand the underlying theory of training, everything else then becomes a lot easier as a result. And the problem that you tend to find with physical training, fitness, strength conditioning is it can be very faddy at times, and a lot of people just jump on the latest bandwagon. And I'm going to put on a short video in a minute which sort of demonstrates that quite well. Now, I will provide a warning that there is a bit of profanity within this video, but please bear with it. And I'm sure you would all recognise this sort of individual from your own experiences in various gymnasium type environments. Okay, guys, I understand there was no sound on that VT there, so I do apologise. But hopefully you probably got the gist of it, that what happens, what I tend to see in the gym happening quite often. We have individuals with maybe a little bit of knowledge or something they've read in the magazine, carting themselves about, acting like Johnny Bravo, thinking they know everything. And that is definitely not what strength conditioning is. Strength conditioning is more of what we call an applied sports science. And it's very much about the knowledge and it's about the coaching. So in terms of knowledge, strength conditioning considers biomechanics, physiology and psychology. It considers data, being able to look at data and obviously make meaningful inferences from that data. It's being able to consider obviously nutrition, one's nutritional state and so on. It's also being able to take all those various elements and apply it in a meaningful coaching setting. And you need to be able to obviously consider the context, who you're working with, obviously the outcomes, what you're trying to achieve, and obviously having that knowledge, that interpersonal knowledge to apply all those science elements in a meaningful coaching setting in order to enhance one's performance. Now, the fundamental role of any form of strength conditioning is to 1, maintain health and well-being, 2, optimize the physical preparedness of an individual for whatever the demands of their sport or activity are, and finally, to minimise the likelihood of injury. Now, hopefully you've all had experience of physical training within the military, may that be in the Army, Navy, RAF or Marines. And obviously you've all had experience with PTIs, and no doubt some of that's been good and some of that's been bad. Now, physical training within the military is fundamentally strength conditioning. But I would say that the strength conditioning or the contemporary strength conditioning practitioner is maybe a little bit different in their mindset and their approach. So the modern strength conditioning practitioner can be viewed as individuals with specialist skills and competencies for the planning and implementation of physical preparation programs for performance. It includes processes that result in physical adaptation through integrating physical components into a single unified program, which complements other aspects of a performer's development. This includes, though not exclusively, areas such as strength, speed, power, endurance, and flexibility. And that is the definition of strength conditioning from an organisation known as the United Kingdom Strength Conditioning Association, and they're the overarching professional body for S&C practitioners. And if you consider obviously what's in that statement, it becomes apparent that S&C is very much both an art and a science. So it's being able to obviously understand underlying scientific principles, but then apply that in the meaningful setting via coaching, and coaching is very much an art. So on the current slide, you'll be sitting there looking at 3 gnomes. What have 3 gnomes got to do with strength conditioning? And it's very much a metaphor. For if you think of a garden, the gardener does not make a plant grow. The job of a gardener is to create the conditions for the plant to grow. And the strength conditioning practitioner, that is their fundamental job. Their job is to create the conditions in order for the individuals who they work with to develop and to improve their performance. And by performance, that might just mean to improve their health and well-being. It might be to improve physical performance for a specific sporting or task demand. Okay, it can vary. It's not just about working at the elite end. Strength conditioning is very much a broad spectrum. Now, when we consider strength conditioning, and obviously it's all about improving one's physical capabilities, we've got to consider, well, what's the strength conditioning coach trying to develop? What physiological components are they trying to improve or enhance in order to improve an individual's performance? Well, there's a number of components, and the first one which you need to consider is health and well-being. We need to have people who are generally fit and well-being and well before we can perform any form of physical training. And again, that's going to be relative. Some people will have physical capabilities beyond that of others. And again, we just have to be able to consider that. But as long as they're healthy and they're in a reasonable condition, we can then utilise that as a platform in which to conduct some form of training in order to develop movement skills, strength, and energy system fitness components. And you very much need to view this as like a car. So if we take a car, we try to line up the chassis. We line up the chassis, we then strengthen the chassis. Once we've strengthened the chassis, we can then pop the engine in form of an energy system. Now, if you think about a lot of PT, especially PT in the military, for a long time, that triangle was turned upside down. Yep, it's all about how big your engine was, how fast and how far you could run. Yep, people paid a lot of service to strength, movement skills was out the window, and health and well-being, yeah, that was just taken as a given. Okay, and it wasn't effective. It didn't prepare people optimally for the demands of service life. So you need to turn that completely upside down and very much view it about developing one's health and well-being first, developing movement skills, then developing strength and energy system components. So if we look at these each in a little bit more depth, so if we consider movement skills, we can categorize movement skills down into 5 subcategories. So we have mobility, so we need to be able to move, and that can be defined as the range of motion achieved at a joint or series of joints. We need to have stability, so the maintenance of equilibrium while stationary or moving. We need to have good motor control, so the ability to use senses such as sight or hearing together with with the body parts, so moving together in sync, so sort of having synchronized movement, so we can perform tasks smoothly and accurately. In addition, speed and agility are also viewed as fundamental movement skills. So speed represents the skills and abilities needed to achieve a high movement velocities, and agility represents the skills and abilities needed to change movement direction, velocity, or mode in response to visual, auditory, or kinesthetic stimuli. So obviously we have the movement skills fitness components, and if we're working in any context, what we should ideally be looking to develop is fundamental movement skills first, to develop that sort of second rung of the pyramid. And what you'll find is a lot of people tend to have deficits in terms of their mobility and stability, and they tend to ignore these. Then they go away, they go into the gym, for example, or they go and do some high-end conditioning. CrossFit's a good example. And because they can't move well, they load up, they then compensate for they make sort of compensatory movement patterns, which then loads the body up unnecessarily and can increase their susceptibility to injury. So if in any of your settings, for whatever you're doing, your fundamental priority first should be to establish good fundamental movement skills, to move well before you then start to consider the development of other fitness components. So if we then consider them, we have strength fitness components. So first up, we have muscular endurance. So muscular endurance represents the ability to exert submaximal forces for a short period of time. We have maximal strength, which is the ability to generate a maximal external force. And then finally, we have explosive strength or rate of force development. And that is our ability to exert the maximal external force in the shortest period of time, i.e. to be explosive. And again, we try to develop these in a systematic order. So we try to develop one's muscular endurance or work capacity. We then develop their strength. We then develop their ability to be explosive. Now, you'll notice that these are all performance-related outcomes, and we don't tend to view concepts such as hypertrophy, i.e. putting on muscle mass, as a physiological outcome to enhance performance. Some people will, so for example, bodybuilders, that may be a desired attribute which they're looking for. But when it comes to performance, to improve one's physical capabilities, we want to look at improving endurance, strength, or explosive strength. After that, we then start to consider the energy system components. So within the human body, we have 3 energy systems. And if to keep this nice and simple, we have the phosphocreatine energy system, which provides us with energy to sustain maximal efforts for short periods of time. We have the anaerobic energy system, which provides us with energy to sustain near maximal efforts for a relatively short period of time. And then finally, you have the aerobic energy system, which provides us with the ability or energy to maintain submaximal efforts for a sustained period of time. Now, every activity or sport has varying demands on the various components of physical fitness. So what I'm going to do in a second is put on a short video. It's a short VT, and it's a rugby orientated VT, and we're just going to observe the All Blacks in action and just consider what fitness components are going to be most important in regards to the sport of rugby. So guys, I understand that there was no audible on that video feed as well, and so I do apologise for that. We actually did run through this as a trial on Monday and everything worked well, but obviously technology is not playing the game this Wednesday evening. So, but hopefully from that short video clip there, obviously you were able to identify certain physical characteristics which are more prevalent in rugby. And you could argue that rugby is one of the best examples of athleticism. It's quite a brilliant sport to watch. I certainly enjoy watching it, and it places a lot of demands on the players. So if we look at the diagram to the right, you'll see there that we've got obviously the various attributes of physical fitness, and you can see there we've got 0 running through to 5 in the spider diagram. So we can see there that agility, mobility, stability and motor control are all really important in rugby. They're all up there, and they should be arguable in any sport. Muscular endurance isn't really that important. Muscular strength is definitely important, as is the rate of force development, so the ability to be explosive. So the ability to go into a ruck and obviously overpower an opponent, or the ability to be explosive and to accelerate off the line to receive a ball or drop the ball or accelerate through and break the line. Aerobic capacity is not really that important, but anaerobic capacity is definitely important. That ability to sustain repeated near maximal sprints, for example. And we can also argue that speed is a very important physiological determinant in rugby, because again, if the play opens up and becomes more expansive, you can accelerate into space and maybe score an absolute cracking try, as demonstrated by some of the All Blacks team in the VT. Now, every sport, every activity is going to be different. They're going to have different demands. And that's important from a training perspective, because you then need to consider, well, what's important? How much time and effort do I need to put into these various fitness components to improve them, to develop them? So, for example, if you're a triathlete, there's going to be not much point you spending a lot of time in the gym doing maximal strength and rate of force development type work, because they're not going to be important physical components for your sport. However, muscular endurance, aerobic capacity is. For example, if we look at wheelchair basketball, yeah, muscular endurance may have the degree of importance, but it's probably similar to rugby. Anaerobic capacity, muscular strength, rate of force development, these are all going to be important physical fitness components which you need to develop. So when you consider this, it sort of just gives you a little bit of focus in terms of what physiological components should be aiming to work on based upon the demands of your sport. Now, you can't work upon them all, okay, but Jack of many, master of none. And again, you need to consider that analogy. So this is all relative to whatever you do, whatever you're training for. But it's important just to consider what you truly need to develop. The one common denominator for all sports, irrespective sport or activities, is fundamental movement skills. And you do definitely need to develop mobility, stability and motor control in relation to what you require for whatever your chosen activity is. So once you've done that, once you've identified what you need to develop, you then need to consider how you're going to develop it. And that's all down to something known as adaptation or training adaptation. Now, the components of fitness can be developed via biological adaptation, and that's a feature common amongst living species. So in the biological system, physiological stress will stimulate adaptive responses to restore homeostasis or balance and to create a supercompensatory effect. So essentially, this is an effect whereby the body adapts to a training stimuli in order to not be stressed to the same degree as it was previously. And all training drives adaptation. So training is a stimuli which creates a stressor upon the human body. That stressor then drives how the body adapts to it. And that will dictate whether you improve your aerobic capacity, whether you improve maximal strength, or whether you improve your flexibility, whatever it may be. However, it's very important to consider that stress is one of these things that you can have too little or you can have potentially too much. And too much stress or training stress can result in excessive or chronic training fatigue, which will result in overtraining and burnout. And the following slide sort of demonstrates that quite well. So stress or eustress, so there's an optimal dose of stress, can be a good thing. Okay, it can help optimize performance, optimize training adaptation. However, if you apply too much stress to a system, to a biological system, you can have fatigue, burnout, potentially health breakdown. At the same time, you can apply too little stress. And if you apply too little stress or too an insufficient training stimuli, for want of a better word, you're not going to see any form of adaptation. Indeed, you see this in the gym time and time again. So you go into the gym and you catch someone at the corner of your eye doing bicep curls in the rack, and he's sitting there with 10 kilos doing 10 reps. The next week, they're still in there doing 10 kilos with 10 for 10 reps. And 5 weeks later, he's still in there. You go in, okay, hi bud, what are you trying to do? I'm trying to get bigger guns. How's that working out for you? I'm not getting any bigger. Well, because you're applying the exact same stimulus which you were applying 10 weeks ago, sorry, and it's making no difference now. You've not applied any form of progression. The body's adapted to that initial stimuli. Now, stress can be multifactorial. So obviously we have training stress and training stimuli, but other stressors out with the training environment can also impact upon adaptation, and that does need to be considered. So that could be stress at home, stress at work, money, health, whatever it may be. And if you're trying to achieve an adaptation or a performance improvement, obviously you're going to the gym doing whatever you need to do. However, if there's things happen out with which are putting additional stress on you, you need to be prepared to consider that may impact upon your progression and development. It may mean that you don't train as hard as what you did previously, and maybe you want to emphasize recovery a little bit more. Now, all training adaptation can sort of be explained by a basic theoretical model known as General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS. And the GAS model was first proposed by Hans Sale in 1956, and essentially he suggested that the body is always trying to maintain homeostasis or balance. You stress the body with a stimuli that represents an alarm phase. You have the resistance phase, whereby the body comes back to a new, higher adaptive state, and that's what we'd call compensation. If you do not allow sufficient time for recovery, again, what can then happen is you have exhaustion, and things can actually start to regress and go downhill. Now, that model sort of been refined over the years, where in 1988, Vershikansky proposed a stimulus fatigue recovery adaptation model, and all he did was change a few words. So obviously he talked about exercise stimulus now. Obviously you have fatigue as a result of training stimuli. Then he talked about when fatigue dissipates, so you have recovery, then you have adaptation in the form of supercompensation. However, if you then detrain, so you don't create that training stimuli, you'll then start to see a detraining effect. That's been refined even further over the past 20 years into something which we now commonly know as the fitness fatigue model, and this is the accepted model within the strength conditioning community. So what you have is you have an exercise stimulus, a training stimulus, which results in fatigue, and you've bought an enhancement in fitness. However, you're not going to get that enhancement in fitness until you recover from the initial fatigue and you sort of bank a little bit of adaptation. So what happens is when you train, you bank an enhancement in physical preparedness, but that enhancement won't come along for maybe 2 or 3 days later due to that supercompensatory effect. So it's all about something known as recovery adaptation, which we talk all about in a little bit more depth in a few more slides. So moving on now from obviously these theories of training adaptation, I'm just going to discuss some of the fundamental principles which underpin effective strength conditioning practice. Now, principles are foundational. Okay, and an American philosopher by the name of Ralph Waldo Emerson sort of summarised this quite well. And Mr. Emerson basically stated that the man who grasps principles can successfully handle their own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble. And indeed, you can see that in many walks of life, and especially in sport, because what you find is those performers who do the basics and do the basic things well, whilst adhering to those fundamental training principles, are the ones who progress the most, the ones who develop and enhance their performance. Because what they do is they stick to the basics and they do the basics well. And you could argue that you see that in every profession. People who do well stick to the basics, stick to the fundamentals, and just continuously apply them. So if we consider, obviously we've talked about the importance of the fundamentals, so what are the fundamental training principles? Well, there's actually 5 of them. So first off, we have specificity, we then have overload, we have recovery adaptation, we have progression, and finally we have reversibility. Now, if in whatever training you do, if you can apply training and stick to these 5 fundamental principles, I can guarantee you your training will be effective. You will see an improvement in your performance. So it's all about specificity, overload, recovery adaptation, progression, and reversibility. So what we're going to do is just look at each of these in a little bit more depth. So first off, specificity. Now, ultimately, the only activity that is truly sport specific is performing the sport itself. So if I want to get better at football, I have to play football. If I want to get better at running, I have to run, and so on. Now, specificity should not be viewed simply as how closely an activity mimics a sport. We're not trying to exactly replicate a sport in a gymnasium setting or in a strength and conditioning setting. Far from it. What we're trying to do is to view how we can potentially develop various capabilities or physiological capacities which are required for sports performance. So we're trying to look at what are the underlying physiological components which dictate performance in that given activity or sport. And what you find is, in all contexts, playing sport or the activity always needs to be supplemented with some form of training activity which will enhance those underlying capabilities, which subsequently will lead to a superior performance. Now, the key to training specificity is to choose training activities that have a high level of transference from training to performance. So obviously performance is that true measure of specificity, but we're trying to elicit this transitional type effect, this transfer. So to achieve this and to help provide some clarity of thought, we can sort of view it through three lenses, and we commonly refer to this as the specificity 3. So specificity 3 suggests that physical performance capabilities should be viewed from 3 different perspectives. So we need to consider the kinematic perspective, so looking at the movements required for the sport and the coordinations patterns required to perform a given skill or activity. We need to look at it from a kinetic perspective to basically examine the forces that are required in order to perform a given skill or activity. And finally, we also need to consider the metabolic perspective to consider what are the energy demands of that given sport or given activity. So we're very much looking at this from the kinematics, the kinetics, and the metabolic type perspectives. So what does that mean? Obviously, I appreciate some of you might not have a grasp of biomechanics. So what is a kinematic analysis? So when we're looking at a kinematic analysis, we're sort of considering, one, well, what is the type of movement used? Is it running? Is it jumping? How far is that jumping? So what distance? At what velocity? In what direction? What movements are used? Is it a single discrete movement, or is it a series of movements? Are they used in combination? What is the fundamental outcome of the task to be achieved? So for example, if it, vertical jump, keep it nice and simple. So vertical jump, obviously what we're looking there is an individual squats down and they're then trying to jump and accelerate themselves or their mass upwards as high as they possibly can. Okay, so they're going in the distance might be, let's say, 18 inches. At what velocity? They're probably going to be quite explosive, moving quite fast. In what direction? It's going to be vertical. What movements are used in combination? Well, it's just a single discrete movement. Okay, and what is the task? To jump as high as you possibly can. So when we consider that, we then start to consider obviously the kinetics behind it. So what is the movement pattern used? It's a squat movement pattern. How much force is required? So that force which we generate into the ground creates a ground reaction force, which sends us in a vertical direction. What type of force is being generated? Is it concentric or isometric? So in regards to vertical jump, it's a concentric force production. How much time is available? So how much time do you have to generate force into the ground? What are the force linkages through the kinetic chain? So you're generating force through the hips, knees and ankles into something called triple extension. Over what range of motion is that force applied? And what direction are you applying that force? So we're applying the force downwards in order to elicit a ground reaction force, which is going to send your body vertically. We then need to consider the metabolics. So what type of movement is involved? With the jump, is explosive. Is it continuous or dispersed? It's dispersed, it's a single action. What is the overall duration of the activity? Milliseconds. What is the movement intensity? It's quite high intensity, arguably, if you're trying to jump as high as you can. What is the duration of each movement? Second or two. And what is the work to rest ratio? Not really important in regards to vertical jump because it's a one-off. So that sort of suggests then that the energy system which you're going to consider for vertical jump is going to be the phosphocreatine energy system. So I appreciate, obviously, when we're talking about specificity and looking at that kinematic, kinetic, metabolic analysis, there's a lot of things to be considered. However, if you can replicate a movement in the gym which looks similar to what you're doing for your given activity, which replicates the demands of it and is similar in terms of the energy production requirements, you're sort of going in the right direction. So hopefully I've not lost too many of you there in regards to obviously that concept of specificity. What I'm going to do now is move on to overload. So overload is based upon the concept of specific adaptation to an imposed demand, the SAID principle. And this was proposed by Vygotsky and Mel Sith. And SAID fundamentally asserts that the human body will adapt to imposed demands, whether they be neurological or biological in nature. So we can achieve an overload or a stressor on the body by altering one or more of the following training variables. So we can alter the training frequency, the intensity of training, how long we're training for, or the type of training. All of that is going to dictate whether or not we can apply an overload or an additional stressor or training stimuli, which is then going to elicit an adaptive response with an individual. Now, an appropriate training response or stimuli, is required in order to provide the necessary overload to trigger a gas type response, that general adaptation syndrome. And from a training perspective, we typically quantify training stress as the training load, and that's very much the intensity times the volume. So training intensity refers to the quality of work being performed per unit of time, and typical measures of this may include your rate of perceived exertion, how hard you find it. It may be work divided by time, obviously power, true determinant of work. It may be speed, which is distance divided by time, or it may be the load lifted, the weight, so normally measured in kilograms. And again, we can adapt or modify one of those variables to increase the given intensity of a training stimuli. Now, training volume refers to the quantity of work performed. And this we can sort of quantify via maybe looking at distance, so meters or kilometers, the duration, how long we're doing something for, or potentially the total load lifted. And we can measure that in terms of load times reps, time sets to give us an objective measure. Now, high intensity training can result in what we call neural or central fatigue. Therefore, consideration needs to be given as to how often intense training can be applied. We're not going to go to the gym and train at high intensity for every session every day, because all it's going to create is too great of a training stimulus, too great of a fatigue, and all will happen is we start to see a decrement in performance. Okay, conversely, at the same time, if we apply too great a volume of training in a single session, for example, that can result in high levels of metabolic or peripheral fatigue, which in turn can reduce the overall intensity of the training. So what we're trying to find is this balance. Okay, there'll be times if we're training whereby we might want to elicit a high intensity training stimulus, and there'll be times we might want to elicit high volume training stimulus. Okay, but we alternate the two, and we also accommodate and allow for periods of recovery, which I'll come on to in the next slide. But by doing so, we create a training stimulus on the body, which forces the body to then adapt. However, if we keep applying that stimulus, if we apply it at too high intensity or at too high a volume, it'll be too much. Again, the body will start to break down. Thinking back to that stress performance model, which I had up a couple of slides ago. So once we've overloaded the body, we've created the stressor, the body's been stressed. Okay, we now need to consider recovery adaptation. Now, training only provides a stimulus for adaptation. Yep, the training is actually the easy part. The recovery adaptation is the part which most people find most difficult. Okay, because they either enjoy too much recovery adaptation time, okay, or they enjoy too little. So recovery and adaptation to a training stress takes place during periods of rest. So when you stress the body, when you rest, when you're sleeping and so on, that is when the body will start to elicit various adaptations. Now, when we're looking at recovery adaptation, we need to consider quite a few areas. We need to consider one's nutrition, sleep, the total training load which should be imposed upon them, the recovery, any additional recovery training modalities such as foam rolling, stretching, yoga and the like, and also the management of external stressors. So if you have additional external stressors, again, that's potentially going to impact upon your recovery adaptation. And an important point to note is that insufficient recovery will lead to impaired adaptation. And this is a common thing which we tend to see in military populations, whereby people think more is better. They go into the gym, they thrash themselves day in, day out, and they wonder why they're not getting any stronger, why they're not getting any fitter. Indeed, they're starting to regress and they're picking up little injuries. 9 times out of 10, it's because the recovery adaptation is not there. The training balance is not there. Okay, and because they're not allowing sufficient time for recovery adaptation, the body just starts to go in a downward spiral. So once we've had a period of recovery adaptation, we then need to be able to progress the training stimuli. So as a body adapts to a training stimulus, there is a need for that training stimulus to be progressed. And one thing's for sure, that monotonous training, and may that be in terms of intensity, volume or methods, can predispose an athlete to something known as accommodation and stagnation, i.e. they're not getting any stronger, they're not getting any fitter, things aren't improving. They're doing the same thing day in, day out. And if you think, obviously, Einstein's definition of stupidity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Yet this is what happens so often in the training environment. The amount of times you can walk into a gym or you can speak to someone and they'll come up and say, I'm not getting any stronger, I'm not running any faster, I'm not going any faster on my bike. And you find that they've been doing the exact same training stimulus time and time again. So if we consider that, we need to be able to progress the training load. Okay, so every session we're looking to elicit this progression in terms of training stimuli. And we can progress the stimuli by either increasing the training intensity, increasing the training volume, and we tend to apply something known as a 10% rule there, so we don't increase the volume by anything more than 10% per session, or by increasing the training complexity, so maybe using a more complex type exercise which challenges the nervous system to adapt. Now when it comes to progression, the progression must be applied gradually. It must be a graduated, graded progression in order to allow the body a sufficient time to obviously recover and adapt from that stimuli. If you jump the progression too much, again, you just tip yourself over the edge, okay, and you go into that point of distress. You're stressing the body too much. Moving on from there, the final fundamental principle which you need to consider is something known as reversibility. And it all boils down to the fact that you can use it or lose it. So the benefits of training are both transient and reversible. Okay, and insufficient training stress can lead to a detraining effect. Therefore, a frequent and consistent exposure to training stress, to training stimuli, is required in order to drive adaptation or just to maintain what you may already have. And it's all very much dependent on something which we call the Goldilocks paradox. Yep, not too much, not too little, just getting that right amount. So guys, that concludes this evening's webinar on fundamental principles of training, and I appreciate that that may have been a little bit theoretically heavy. However, fundamentals are exactly what they say in the tin. They underpin all effective training. And if you can grasp what the fundamental principles of training are in terms of specificity, overload, recovery, adaptation, progression and reversibility, and apply it to whatever you're doing in your own settings, okay, your training will be effective. You will see an improvement in performance, I guarantee it. Now, on the current slide, obviously I've put a number of references there, so if you obviously want to look into this in a little bit more depth, there's various reference sources there which are certainly worth having a read of. But what we'll move on to now is some questions and answers. So if you have any questions for myself, please feel free to fire them across via the text box, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Perfect. Thank you, JP. I'm going to start with the first question we've had is, as a physically and mentally disabled veteran with bilateral false knees and severe lumbar osteoarthritis, what type of home-based exercise program would you recommend to try and regain some form of basic fitness, please?
So based on what you've described there, I'd be very much looking at doing some sort of upper body dominant type activities. So if we're looking at movement skills, obviously you can definitely do work in terms of thoracic spine mobility. There's numerous drills which you can use to enhance that, and various upper limb shoulder mobility type drills. Upper body strength training, or horizontal push pulling, vertical push pulling, again, that's all achievable. In terms of energy system development, again, most gyms now have a lot of upper body endurance type equipment, so hand cycling, ski ergo, rowing machines can be utilised. So some facilities might have rowing machines whereby you just have the seat, so you don't have to put any flexion or extension through the knees. But fundamentally, it's just about adapting. Obviously adapting the modalities which you choose to use, but you can still definitely work upon movement skill, strength and energy system fitness components just to maintain your general health and well-being. One thing I didn't mention there as well, and something used to get hammered home when I was in ERI, is that movement is medicine, and there's a lot to be said for that, and there's a lot of their building body of evidence at the moment that demonstrates that when you just perform some form of physical activity, you'll start to feel better in yourself. And we're actually seeing now a body of evidence which is supporting that, supporting actually underlying neurological changes which show enhancements and improvements in people's general well-being, which again is important to consider.
Thank you. The second question we've had submitted is, are some individuals genetically more predisposed to one form of movement or another, such as aerobic or anaerobic movement?
So we can all move. We can all move well. We're all born with that innate ability. If you just look at when we were kids, we could run, jump, squat, and then as we age, obviously we lose that. So in terms of movement, yep, we all have the same capabilities. In terms of our genetic predisposition for certain activities, yes, there is genetic markers there. So certain individuals who have certain genes which predispose them to be more adapt better to strength training, i.e. they'll put on muscle mass and be stronger, whereas other individuals, depending upon their phenotype, will demonstrate better adaptations in regards to aerobic endurance type activities. So that does vary. One of the important things to consider, though, is that we can always enhance these various physiological attributes. We can always enhance them to a higher level. However, dependent upon your phenotype dictates how high you're going to get. So you might have something, so like me, I'm not exactly massive, okay, and there's no way in hell I'm ever going to turn into Johnny Bravo or be competing at the Olympics in weightlifting. It's never going to happen for me, okay, but I can get stronger, I can improve it. However, I am very good at endurance activities, and I know fine well if I spend a lot of time on the bike or running, I can massively improve those elements. But again, we sort of figure these things out ourselves as we move on through. So yes, there is an element of nature v nurture. We can improve things, but at the same time, nature dictates how much we can improve them too.
Perfect. Are there any websites that you would suggest for us to find the strength and conditioning exercises that might be most relevant to us?
I would say there isn't really. There's numerous sources, some good, some bad. I don't really have a distinct source I go to when it comes to prescribing exercise prescription. But what you can do is you can look at a number of overarching organisations which can point you in the right direction. So the United Kingdom Strength Conditioning Association have something called IUKSCA, which is a subscription. I think it's £30 a year, and you can go on and have access to various technical model videos of various upper body exercises, lower body exercises. The NSCA, so the National Strength Conditioning Association in America, have the exact same. In regards to YouTube, obviously there's numerous examples out there on YouTube. Some are good, some are bad, but I don't really have any specific ones I can point you in the direction of, I'm afraid.
No worries. Next question. How do you judge whether you are doing too much or too little?
One of the best elements is subjective feel. So which way, often I mentioned something about RPE, rate of perceived exertion, so how hard you push yourself. And we all gauge RPE differently. And you can apply RPE for both endurance and strength training. So if you go on a session, you will know if you do something too little, it doesn't make a change. You'll know if you do some sort of training activity, it feels, yeah, just right. At the same time, you'll know if you feel, yeah, that maybe I pushed it. You might not, you might think I've done a really good session, then the next day you're really fatigued and tired. So that's a real good combat indicator that, yeah, maybe that session was a little bit too much. Maybe I have to wind it back a little. Or maybe I didn't allow sufficient time for recovery adaptation. Like it is very subjective, and it's very much just about finding that balance, but it's about listening to your body. And so many people in a training perspective do not listen to the body. They just crack on mindlessly, and they either do too little or they do too much. And again, maybe just take a diary to rate whatever you're doing, use a 0 to 10 RPE scale. So 10 being absolutely ninja, 0 being nothing. You're maybe trying to get a sweet spot about 6, 7. You do a couple of training sessions and you find that when you look back at it, you had a 6, you had a 7, you had an 8, 6, 7, 8, and you think, okay, maybe those sessions that were around the 7, they were ideal for my purposes and I need to stick to around that.
The next question, how can I adapt exercises for my impairment? Is there somewhere I can go to find specific exercises?
All exercises can be adapted, and obviously we learned this at Headley Court. So when I was at Headley, I came back with HERIC 10, got posted straight there, and obviously we had the surge coming off Baki-Panchai Penang. And complex trauma went from 12 patients to 70 odd patients at any one time. And these were obviously all guys and girls with a lot of them with traumatic amputations. And because everything was underpinned by exercise rehabilitation, it was fundamentally make it work. So we had to experiment. And what we found through experimentation was that we could fundamentally use anything. We just had to adapt it to the specific needs of that individual. And it was very much that concept of being differently abled. So for example, everyone can horizontally push and pull. But let's say someone had a limitation in their shoulder where they couldn't go through a full range, we would just go through a partial range. Let's say it was an overhead press. Someone didn't have the ability to press overhead and we could only get them to 90 degrees. Fine, we'd just come up to 90 degrees. We'd work within that limited range. We may use exercises where we provide a lot of stability or where we don't provide a lot of stability. We may do exercises in an unstable environment. We may not. We may do them on a nice, stable environment using a machine. It varied. And it's very much about looking at what are exercises which you may know, which are commonly prescribed exercises, and then just thinking, well, can I perform it? No. What are the limitations that stop me from performing it? Limited range of motion, weakness, pain, whatever. Then thinking about, okay, how can I adapt that exercise for my specific needs? Because everyone's going to be different. But the key thing, and I would strongly suggest this to everyone, is not to be afraid, is to go in there and just try it. And you will know if it works or if it doesn't work. And when you find, if it doesn't work, think about a solution where you can work around it, you can work the problem, but still go through the movement, so to speak. So it's very much about flexibility, adaptation. There's no, I would never ever say that, oh, there's specific exercises for this disability or not. It shouldn't work like that. It never should. It's about just looking at what's there and making it work for you.
Great. And if I'm doing some local competitions for cycling, should I also be doing strength and conditioning?
Oh yes. Well, you should so if you're a cyclist, and so my PhD at the moment is looking at the optimization of hand cycling, and the big thing I'm looking at is the use of concurrent training, which is essentially replacing 30% of training volume with strength training to enhance overall hand cycling performance. And does it work? Yes. Is evidence there to support it? Yes. Is evidence there to support in normal road cycling? Yes, there's a strong body of evidence. Therefore, what I'd suggest is potentially look at your overall training volume, maybe take out 20-30% of that and replace it with some form of lower limb strength training intervention, whereby you're squatting, deadlifting, split squats, lunges, those type of exercises, and improve your ability to generate force through your lower limbs. What that will then improve, it will improve your movement economy, and it will also improve your anaerobic threshold, both of which are important determinants of cycling performance. What you do have to manage is fatigue. So if you go into the gym, if you load yourself up, you might elicit quite a what we call exercise-induced muscle damage. The next day you might be walking like John Wayne, especially for the first session. So what you might need to do is just manage your recovery adaptation for a couple of weeks, allow for obviously that super compensatory effect to take place, maybe do 3 weeks of concurrent training, maybe take a 4th week where you strip everything down and then retest yourself. And I'd be pretty confident if you dialed it in correctly, you would start to see considerable improvements, significant considerable improvements in your cycling performance capabilities if you get that, if you nail it just right.
Cool. Where can I find a strength and conditioning coach to help me?
Easy. Go onto the UKSCA website and there's a directory of strength conditioning coaches. For all of you, strength conditioning is about to become a chartered profession in the United Kingdom, which means that we'll be given the same professional status as physiotherapists, occupational therapists and so on. And the reason for that is at the moment there's numerous personal trainers who might be good coaches, but they don't have the necessary knowledge, core competencies or experiences to classify themselves as strength conditioning coaches. Therefore, if you're looking for a strength conditioning practitioner, you want to find someone who's accredited by the Strength Conditioning Associated UKSCA. So you're looking for the acronym ASCC, Accredited Strength Conditioning Coach. And the UKSCA website basically has everyone who's listed as an accredited strength conditioning coach in the UK on there. And if you go on, you type in your postcode and they'll tell you whoever's UKSCA accredited in your local area. So that's what I'd definitely recommend as your first port of call.
And the last question we have this evening, JP, is do you have sport-specific strength and conditioning advice? I do archery, cycling and indoor rowing. Is there a programme I can follow for all 3 sports?
There's not a generic programme. I don't personally work off generic type programmes. Everything's individual. So in regards to your own needs, it would be a case of obviously sitting down with an S&C practitioner, identifying obviously doing a needs analysis, what are the demands of your respective sports, and then from that developing an appropriate training program which is fit for you as an individual. I would always steer away from generic programs because they are what they say in the tin, generic. What we're trying to do is obviously individualise to the requirements of the individual, and apply then subsequently those fundamental principles of training in order to enhance our or to enhance your performance. So probably not the answer you're looking for. I do apologise, but again, I think it's far better to be honest in that regard.
Amazing. So that concludes our Q&A section for this evening. I think you'd all join me in thanking JP for both his presentation and his answers at the end there. I think I've mentioned it at the beginning, but in case I didn't, the recording of this webinar plus the handouts will be sent to you all in a Sports Recovery newsletter, along with the question and answer section. We'll type that up for you. So you should get all of that. We'll also chat to JP after this to see if we can get the links for the videos that you didn't have sound to, so that we can include those to send out if we can. Also in that newsletter that we send to you guys in the next coming few days will be a link to a survey, and we would really appreciate it if you could give us your feedback on how you think tonight's webinar went. It will allow us to continue delivering these hot topic webinars and give you guys what you want to kind of see in terms of topics and content. If you have any further questions, please just give the Sports Recovery team an email on sportsrecovery@helpforheroes.org.uk. But yeah, thank you so much for listening this evening, and thank you to JP again, and we hope you'll have a lovely evening. Take care. Bye.